The rain hammered against the windows of Bistro Valencia that Friday evening, creating a rhythmic backdrop that seemed to echo through every corner of the upscale establishment. Emily Martinez wiped down the mahogany bar for what felt like the 100th time, her practiced movements betraying none of the restlessness that churned beneath her composed exterior. At 24, she'd perfected the art of invisibility, slipping between tables like a shadow, delivering plates with quiet efficiency, collecting tips that barely covered her monthly expenses. The bistro's warm amber lighting cast gentle shadows across her face, highlighting the determined set of her jaw that most patrons never bothered to notice. Tonight felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The usual Friday crowd mingled over wine and conversation, their laughter punctuating the soft jazz that drifted from the restaurant's sound system. Emily found herself glancing toward the old upright piano that sat in the corner, a relic from the bistro's earlier days as a music venue. Its polished black surface reflected the flickering candlelight from nearby tables, and she couldn't help but feel its silent call. The evening's rhythm was interrupted when the front door burst open with dramatic flair. In walked Jackson Delgado, shaking raindrops from his expensive coat with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted their place in the world. At 28, he carried himself with the swagger of a man who'd built his tech empire from scratch, and wasn't about to let anyone forget it. His dark eyes swept the room with calculated interest, taking inventory of everything and everyone as if assessing their worth. Emily had heard whispers about him, the young entrepreneur who'd made headlines for his controversial business practices and his talent for stirring up drama wherever he went. She watched him settle into a corner booth, immediately commanding attention from the waitstaff with a simple gesture. There was something magnetic about his presence, even if it came wrapped in arrogance. He ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu without glancing at the price, his voice carrying across the dining room as he regaled his dinner, companion with stories of his latest venture. Emily tried to focus on her work, but she found her gaze drifting back to him, puzzled by the way he seemed to fill the entire room with his energy. As the evening progressed, Jackson's voice grew, louder, his gestures more animated. He was clearly enjoying being the center of attention, feeding off the curious glances and whispered conversations his presence had sparked. Emily continued her duties, refilling water glasses and clearing plates, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, like the tension in the air before lightning strikes. She'd learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now they were telling her that this particular storm was just getting started. When Jackson's eyes finally landed on her, Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. His gaze was calculating, assessing, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he'd just discovered. She maintained her professional composure, offering a polite nod before turning her attention back to the wine glasses she was polishing. But she could feel his attention lingering, and something told her that her quiet evening was about to become anything but. The other patrons seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere too. Conversations became more subdued as people began to notice the way Jackson's attention had focused on the unassuming waitress who moved through the restaurant like a gentle breeze. Emily's colleague, Sophia, shot her a warning look from across the room. They'd both dealt with difficult customers before, and Jackson's reputation preceded him. But Emily simply squared her shoulders and continued her work, refusing to be intimidated by his scrutiny. As the clock struck 9, the bistro's usual Friday evening energy reached its peak. The wine was flowing freely, the conversation was animated, and the storm outside seemed to have trapped everyone in a bubble of warmth and conviviality. It was then that Jackson rose from his table, his movements deliberate and theatrical, as if he were preparing to deliver a performance. Emily felt her stomach tighten as she realized that whatever was coming next, she was likely to be at the center of it. The unexpected guest had arrived, bringing with him a whirlwind of possibility and challenge that would change everything Emily thought she knew about herself. As she stood behind the bar, polishing glasses with practiced precision, she had no idea that her carefully constructed world of quiet routine was about to be turned completely upside down. The rain continued to fall against the windows, but inside Bistro Valencia, a different kind of storm was about to begin. The memory always came to her in moments of stillness, like now, as Emily mechanically folded napkins in the bistro's quiet afternoon lull. She could see herself at 7 years old, standing on her tiptoes to reach the keys of her grandmother Isabella's weathered upright piano. The instrument had been the centerpiece of their small apartment in the Cuban quarter of Charleston, its mahogany finish worn smooth by decades of loving hands. Isabella would sit beside her, patient and encouraging, guiding her small fingers across the keys with the gentleness of someone who understood that music wasn't just sound. It was soul made audible. "Mija," Isabella would whisper, her voice thick with the accent that painted every word with warmth. "The piano doesn't care if you're rich or poor, young or old. It only cares if you're honest." Those words had become Emily's anchor through the storms that followed. When Isabella passed away 2 years later, she'd left behind not just the piano, but a legacy of quiet strength and unwavering belief in the power of dreams. Emily's mother, overwhelmed by grief and the practical demands of raising 2 children alone, had wanted to sell the instrument. But Emily had fought for it with a determination that surprised everyone, including herself. The piano became her sanctuary through the turbulent years that followed. When her mother worked double shifts at the hospital, Emily would come home to find her younger brother Miguel waiting for her, his backpack still slung over his shoulders and his eyes bright with the day's adventures. At 15 now, he was everything she wasn't: outgoing, confident, blessed with their father's easy charm and their mother's resilient spirit. But back then, when he was just a scared little boy missing his grandmother, Emily would sit him down beside her on the worn piano bench and play the lullabies Isabella had taught her. Music became their language of comfort, a bridge between the harsh realities of their daily life and the dreams that Isabella had planted in Emily's heart. While other teenagers were discovering social media and weekend parties, Emily was discovering Chopin and Debussy, losing herself in compositions that spoke to something deep within her soul. Her fingers would dance across the keys, finding solace in the complex melodies that somehow made sense of the chaos swirling around her. The bills piling up on the kitchen counter, her mother's exhausted sighs, the way other kids at school looked right through her. None of it mattered when she was playing. By the time she reached high school, Emily's talent had caught the attention of her music teacher, Senora Rodriguez, who saw something special in the quiet girl who stayed after class to practice. She encouraged Emily to audition for music school, painting vivid pictures of conservatories and concert halls, of a future where her gift could flourish. Emily allowed herself to dream, spending hours researching programs and imagining a life where music wasn't just her escape, but her profession. She applied to 3 schools, her heart full of hope and her fingers crossed for the scholarship that would make it all possible. The rejection letters arrived on the same day, each one a polite but firm reminder that talent alone wasn't enough. Without the financial resources to support her education or the connections to open doors, Emily watched her dreams slip away like sand through her fingers. The disappointment was devastating, but it was Miguel's acceptance to a magnet school for science and technology that really put things in perspective. His education would require sacrifices from the entire family, and Emily knew without being told that her dreams would have to wait. She took the job at Bistro Valencia the week after graduation, trading her cap and gown for an apron and order pad. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it helped pay for Miguel's school supplies and her mother's medications. The bistro's piano became a cruel reminder of what might have been, sitting in the corner like a beautiful ghost haunting her daily routine. She'd catch herself staring at it during slow afternoons, her fingers unconsciously moving as if remembering complex passages she'd once mastered. But late at night, when the bistro was closed and the cleaning crew had gone home, Emily would sometimes slip her key into the lock and steal a few precious minutes with the instrument. Her fingers would find the keys in the darkness, and for those brief moments, she was 17 again, full of hope and possibility. She'd play the pieces that Isabella had loved, gentle waltzes and passionate nocturnes that filled the empty restaurant with echoes of dreams deferred but never truly abandoned. The years passed and Emily learned to find satisfaction in small victories, helping Miguel with his college applications, seeing the pride in her mother's eyes when she managed to cover all their expenses, earning the respect of her colleagues through consistent hard work and quiet competence. She convinced herself that dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford, that music was something she could love from a distance, like admiring a sunset without expecting to paint it. Yet the music never truly left her. It lived in the rhythm of her footsteps as she moved between tables, in the way she hummed softly while polishing silverware, in the unconscious melodies that played in her mind during the long hours of service. Isabella's piano might have been sold years ago to help pay for Miguel's college tuition, but the music itself had taken root so deeply in Emily's soul that nothing could dislodge it. As she stood in the bistro that rainy Friday evening, she had no idea that all those years of quiet practice and patient dreaming were about to find their voice in the most unexpected way possible. Jackson's laugh cut through the ambient chatter of the restaurant like a blade, sharp and calculated in its delivery. He'd been holding court at his corner table for the better part of an hour, regaling his dinner companion with stories of his latest acquisition, a struggling music streaming platform he'd purchased for pennies on the dollar. His voice carried that particular brand of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. And tonight, he seemed especially pleased with himself. Emily had been trying to ignore the way his gestures grew more animated with each glass of wine, but it was becoming increasingly difficult as his volume rose and his commentary grew more pointed. "You see, Carlos," Jackson said, leaning back in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. "Most people have no idea what real talent looks like. They think anyone who can plunk out chopsticks deserves a standing ovation." His companion, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, nodded eagerly at everything Jackson said, clearly uncomfortable with the attention they were drawing but unwilling to challenge his host. Emily noticed how other diners had begun to glance in their direction, some with curiosity, others with visible annoyance at the disruption to their intimate evening. The turning point came when Jackson's gaze wandered to the piano in the corner, his eyes lighting up with the predatory gleam of someone who'd just spotted an opportunity for entertainment. He gestured toward the instrument with his wine glass, a theatrical flourish that drew the attention of nearby tables. "Now there's a perfect example," he announced, his voice carrying across the dining room with uncomfortable clarity. "Restaurants love to put these things in the corner, probably thinking they add some kind of atmosphere. But I'd bet good money that nobody in this entire place could actually make it sing." Emily felt her cheeks flush as she realized where this was heading. She'd dealt with difficult customers before, drunk patrons who thought tipping well gave them the right to be inappropriate, business executives who treated service staff like furniture. But there was something particularly unsettling about Jackson's brand of entitled arrogance. She continued clearing tables, hoping that if she kept her head down and maintained her professional composure, his attention would move onto something else. But Jackson wasn't the type to let an opportunity for drama slip away so easily. "Take our lovely waitress here," he continued, his words dripping with false charm as he turned his full attention to Emily. The room seemed to quiet around them, other conversations dying as people sensed the shift in energy. Emily's hands stilled on the water pitcher she'd been refilling, her heart beginning to race as she felt dozens of eyes focusing on her. "I'm sure she's perfectly competent at taking orders and bringing food, but music?" He chuckled, the sound harsh and dismissive. "That's a different beast entirely. That requires real skill, real training, real class." Sophia, who'd been watching the scene unfold from behind the bar, took a step forward, her protective instincts kicking in. She'd worked with Emily for 3 years and knew her colleague's gentle nature made her an easy target for bullies. But Emily caught her eye and shook her head slightly, a gesture that said she could handle this herself. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the best way to deal with provocative behavior was to simply not engage, to let it burn itself out without adding fuel to the fire. But Jackson wasn't finished. He stood up from his table, his movements deliberate and theatrical, clearly enjoying the audience he'd attracted. "In fact," he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone making a grand proclamation, "I'd be willing to bet that our gracious server here wouldn't even dare to touch those keys. Not because she doesn't want to, mind you, but because she knows, deep down, that she'd just embarrass herself in front of all these nice people. His smile was sharp as a razor, designed to cut deep and leave lasting damage. The challenge hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Emily could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders, the uncomfortable silence that follows when someone crosses a line that shouldn't be crossed. Her colleague Miguel had always told her that bullies were just insecure people trying to make themselves feel bigger by making others feel smaller, but knowing that intellectually didn't make dealing with them any easier in the moment. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she set down the water pitcher, her mind racing through possible responses. She could ignore him completely, finish her shift with dignity intact, and let management deal with his behavior. She could offer a polite deflection, perhaps suggesting that music was best left to the professionals. Or she could do something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She could call his bluff. The restaurant had grown quiet enough that the sound of rain against the windows seemed amplified. Each drop a tiny percussion note in the symphony of tension that had built around them. Emily looked at Jackson, really looked at him, and saw something that surprised her. Beneath all the bluster and arrogance there was a hollowness, a desperate need for attention and validation that she recognized from her own darkest moments. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it helped her understand it. As she stood there, caught between the safety of silence and the risk of action, Emily heard Isabella's voice echoing across the years. "Mija, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's playing your heart's song even when your hands are shaking." The memory hit her like a physical force, reminding her of who she used to be before life taught her to make herself small, before she learned that dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Each beat so loud she was certain everyone in the restaurant could hear it. The silence stretched between her and Jackson, thick with expectation and challenge, while dozens of pairs of eyes watched to see what she would do next. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind with startling clarity. "Never let fear drown out your music, Mija. When the moment comes to sing, you must find your voice, no matter how much your hands shake." Isabella had said those words on Emily's 10th birthday, right before she'd played her first complete piece for the family gathered in their small living room. Time seemed suspended as Emily stood there, the weight of every dream she'd ever tucked away pressing against her chest like a physical force. She thought about Miguel, now a sophomore at the College of Charleston studying engineering, who still believed his big sister could do anything she set her mind to. She thought about her mother, working the night shift at the hospital, who'd sacrificed so much to give her children opportunities she'd never had. But mostly, she thought about the 7-year-old girl who used to climb onto Isabella's piano bench with absolute confidence, never doubting that the music inside her deserved to be heard. The restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath as Emily slowly untied her apron, her movements deliberate and measured despite the tremor in her hands. Sophia's eyes widened behind the bar, a mixture of concern and admiration flashing across her face as she realized what was about to happen. Other staff members had stopped their work entirely, sensing that they were about to witness something significant, though none of them could have predicted just how profound this moment would become. Jackson's smirk faltered slightly as he watched Emily fold her apron with careful precision and place it on the nearest table. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd been counting on her embarrassment, her retreat, her capitulation to his superior position. The fact that she was moving toward the piano instead of away from the confrontation clearly caught him off guard. His companion Carlos shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly wishing he'd chosen a different restaurant for their business dinner. With each step toward the piano, Emily felt layers of self-doubt and carefully constructed protection falling away like old paint. The worn carpet beneath her feet became the path between who she'd been forced to become and who she'd always been meant to be. Her server's uniform, which had felt like armor for so many years, now felt like a costume she was finally ready to shed. The conversations around the restaurant had died completely now, creating an atmosphere so charged with anticipation that even the sounds from the kitchen seemed muted. She reached the piano and paused, her fingers hovering inches above the keys that had been calling to her for years. The instrument was well maintained despite its age, its black surface reflecting the warm lighting like still water. Emily could see her own reflection in the polished wood, and for a moment, she was struck by how much she looked like Isabella in this light. The same determined set to her jaw, the same fire in her dark eyes that had burned bright, even in the face of life's countless challenges. The piano bench creaked softly as she settled onto it, adjusting her position with the automatic precision of someone who'd spent countless hours in this exact posture. Her hands found their natural position above the keyboard, and she felt a shock of recognition run through her. This was home. This was where she belonged. This was the place where Emily Martinez, the cautious waitress, transformed into Emily. Martinez, the musician who'd once dreamed of concert halls and standing ovations. She flexed her fingers, working out the tension that had built up over years of carrying trays instead of playing scales, of wiping down tables instead of practicing arpeggios. The muscle memory was still there, dormant but not dead, like a language she'd spoken fluently in childhood and was now remembering how to form on her tongue. Jackson's challenge seemed distant now, almost irrelevant. This moment had become about something much bigger than proving a point to an arrogant stranger. Emily closed her eyes and let herself remember the feeling of the music flowing through her, the way it had always been her most honest form of self-expression. She thought about all the pieces she'd learned over the years, all the composers who'd become her silent companions during lonely evenings and difficult times. Chopin, who understood melancholy better than anyone she'd ever met. Debussy, who could paint pictures with sound that were more vivid than anything she'd ever seen. And tonight, she knew exactly what she needed to play. As her fingers finally made contact with the keys, Emily felt a jolt of electricity run through her entire body. The connection was immediate and profound, like greeting an old friend after years of separation. This was her leap of faith, not just in her ability to play, but in her right to claim this moment, to take up space, to let her voice be heard after years of careful silence. The restaurant, Jackson's challenge, even her own fears seemed to fade into the background as she prepared to pour everything she'd ever felt into the music that was about to fill the room. The opening notes of Moonlight Sonata floated into the air like dewdrops on silk, each one crystal clear and achingly beautiful. Emily's fingers trembled for the first few measures, betraying the nerves that threatened to overwhelm her, but as the familiar melody began to weave its spell through the restaurant, her hands found their confidence. This piece had been Isabella's favorite, the one she'd played every Sunday evening while Emily sat curled up on the threadbare sofa, homework forgotten, completely transported by the haunting beauty of Beethoven's genius. The transformation was immediate and profound. Emily's shoulders relaxed as the music began to flow through her, years of suppressed artistry suddenly given voice through the weathered keys. Her posture straightened, and the careful mask of professional politeness she'd worn for so long melted away, replaced by an expression of pure, concentrated emotion. This was Emily as she was meant to be. Not the invisible waitress who moved through the world trying not to disturb anyone, but the artist who had been waiting patiently beneath the surface for her moment to emerge. The restaurant had fallen, completely silent now, even the sounds from the kitchen fading into respectful quiet as the staff stopped their work to listen. The melody drifted through the dining room like incense, touching every corner and every heart with its gentle power. An elderly couple at table 6 found themselves reaching for each other's hands, remembering their own first dance 50 years ago. A young father at the bar felt his eyes well up as he thought about his daughter's piano lessons, the ones he'd been too busy to attend lately. Jackson's smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of genuine bewilderment. This wasn't supposed to happen. The quiet waitress was supposed to shrink away from his challenge, not rise to meet it with such devastating grace. He found himself leaning forward despite himself, caught up in the spell that Emily was weaving with her music. His companion Carlos had stopped pretending to eat entirely, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth as he stared at the piano with naked amazement. As Emily moved into the second movement, her playing gained strength and complexity. The hesitation that had marked the opening phrases disappeared completely, replaced by a confidence that seemed to grow with each passing measure. Her fingers danced across the keys with increasing boldness, finding nuances in the familiar piece that she'd never noticed before. It was as if years of suppressed emotion were pouring out through her fingertips, Every disappointment and deferred dream transformed into something beautiful and transcendent. Sophia stood behind the bar with tears streaming down her face, finally, understanding why Emily sometimes hummed those complex melodies while she worked, why she sometimes got that faraway look in her eyes when the restaurant's background music played something classical. She'd always known there was more to her colleague than met the eye, but she'd never imagined anything like this. The woman at the piano bore little resemblance to the careful, self-effacing server she'd worked alongside for 3 years. The music seemed to reach into every corner of the room, finding the forgotten dreams and abandoned hopes that everyone carried inside them. A middle-aged businessman remembered the saxophone he'd played in high school, before practicality and responsibility had convinced him to put away such foolish pursuits. A young couple on their anniversary thought about the love songs they'd once written for each other, before mortgages and career demands had consumed all their creative energy. Emily herself was lost in the music now, years of careful self-control, finally giving way to pure expression. She could feel Isabella's presence as clearly as if her grandmother were sitting beside her on the bench, guiding her through the difficult passages and encouraging her to trust in the gift they'd nurtured together all those years ago. The pain of loss, the frustration of dreams deferred, the quiet desperation of feeling trapped in a life too small for her spirit. All of it was flowing out through the music, transformed from personal anguish into universal beauty. The third, movement began with renewed intensity. Emily's whole body now moving with the rhythm as the piece built toward its climactic passages. Her years of practice were evident in every phrase, the countless hours she'd spent perfecting her technique finally finding their purpose. But more than technical skill, what filled the room was pure emotion, raw, honest, and completely unguarded. This was what Isabella had meant about the piano not caring about wealth or status. It only cared about truth, and Emily was finally telling hers. As the final notes began to fade, the silence that followed was different from the expectant hush that had preceded the performance. This was the silence of awe, of people trying to process what they'd just experienced. Emily's hands remained poised above the keys for a moment, as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. When she finally looked up, she saw a room full of faces transformed by the music she'd shared, and for the first time in years, she felt completely, authentically herself. The silence that followed the final notes was so complete it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on the restaurant like a held breath. Emily sat motionless at the piano, her hands still positioned above the keys, afraid that any movement might shatter the spell that had transformed the ordinary Friday evening into something magical. She could feel the energy in the room, electric and alive, as if every person present had been touched by something they hadn't expected to encounter. Her heart was still racing, but now it was from exhilaration rather than fear, the rush of having finally given voice to the music that had lived inside her for so long. Then, like a dam breaking, the applause erupted. It started with the elderly couple at table 6, their weathered hands coming together in appreciation that seemed to come from their very souls. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was on its feet, clapping with an enthusiasm that shook the wine glasses and rattled the silverware. Sophia was crying openly now, her hands pressed to her mouth in amazement at what she'd just witnessed. Even the kitchen staff had emerged from the back, drawn by the unprecedented sound of sustained applause in their normally sedate establishment. Emily slowly turned on the piano bench to face the room, her dark eyes wide with wonder as she took in the sea of faces. These were the same patrons she'd served countless times, the ones who'd looked through her as if she were invisible, who'd treated her as nothing more than an efficient mechanism for bringing food to their tables. Now they were looking at her with respect, with admiration, with the recognition she'd craved her entire life. The transformation was so profound it felt like stepping into an alternate reality where dreams actually came true. Jackson remained, seated, his hands frozen in mid-clap as he struggled to process what had just happened. The smug confidence that had defined his entire evening had evaporated, leaving behind a man who suddenly realized he'd made a terrible miscalculation. His challenge had been meant to embarrass and diminish, but instead it had revealed something extraordinary that he clearly hadn't anticipated. His companion Carlos was applauding enthusiastically, his business dinner forgotten in the wake of the unexpected concert they'd just witnessed. As the applause finally began to die down, Jackson seemed to realize that some response was expected of him. He rose from his chair with obvious reluctance, his usual theatrical flair replaced by awkward uncertainty. The room's attention shifted to him, waiting to see how he would handle this reversal of fortune. Emily watched him approach, her expression calm and composed, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had reclaimed her power in the most beautiful way possible, and nothing he could say now would diminish that accomplishment. "Well," Jackson said, his voice lacking its earlier boldness as he struggled to find words that would restore some semblance of his shattered authority. "That was unexpected. I suppose everyone has their hidden talents." His attempt at a casual dismissal fell flat in the face of what everyone had just experienced. The compliment was so obviously inadequate, so transparently begrudging, that it actually served to highlight the magnitude of what Emily had just accomplished rather than diminish it. Emily stood slowly, smoothing down her server's uniform with hands that were finally steady again. When she met Jackson's eyes, there was no anger in her gaze, no triumph over his discomfort, just a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her very core. The frightened waitress who had untied her apron 20 minutes ago was gone, replaced by someone who finally knew her own worth. When she spoke, her voice carried the same clear, measured tone that had guided her fingers across the keys. "Music doesn't need your permission to be heard," she said, her words carrying easily across the still attentive dining room. The statement was simple, but it carried layers of meaning that everyone present understood instinctively. It was about more than music. It was about worth, about dignity, about the right to exist fully in the world regardless of what others might think or say. It was the quiet declaration of someone who had finally found her voice and wasn't going to be silenced again. The response to her words was immediate and visceral. Several people in the restaurant actually gasped at the elegant precision of her comeback, while others nodded in appreciation of her grace under pressure. Jackson's face flushed red as he realized that his attempt to humiliate her had not only failed spectacularly but had actually provided the catalyst for her moment of triumph. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then seemed to think better of it. His usual quick wit apparently abandoned him when faced with such quiet strength. Sophia broke the tension by starting to applaud again, her face shining with pride for her colleague and friend. Others quickly joined in, creating another wave of appreciation that seemed to lift Emily even higher. She acknowledged the applause with a gracious nod, then began to make her way back toward the bar where her apron waited. But something fundamental had changed. She was no longer just Emily the waitress who happened to play piano. She was Emily the musician who happened to work at a restaurant, and everyone in the room could feel the difference. As she reached for her apron, Emily caught her reflection in the mirror behind the bar and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Gone was the carefully neutral expression she'd perfected over years of service industry work. In its place was the face of someone who had just remembered who she really was. Someone who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. The silence after applause had been filled with more than appreciation. It had been filled with recognition, respect, and the profound satisfaction of a dream finally given voice. 3 days later, Emily was restocking wine glasses when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice was warm and professional. Roberto Sandoval, a legendary Cuban-American pianist in Charleston's music scene. Emily's breath caught as she recognized the name from local arts magazines and concert posters. "Was at Bistro Valencia Friday evening when you played," Roberto said. "I've been playing professionally for 35 years, and I haven't heard anything that moved me like your performance in a very long time. You weren't just playing the notes, you were living them." Emily trembled, overwhelmed. This was Roberto Sandoval, whose albums had soundtracked her private musical moments. "I run a small recording studio," he continued. "I'm putting together a collaborative session for next week featuring local artists. I'd very much like you to be part of it." The invitation hung like a lifeline. Emily's mind raced through practical considerations, work schedule, finances, her inner voice insisting she wasn't qualified. But underneath was growing excitement, The same feeling from childhood when Isabella first showed her how to make the piano sing. "I'm not a professional," Emily whispered. "I don't have formal training beyond high school. No recording experience." "Miss Martinez," Roberto interrupted gently. "Some of the most powerful musicians learned in living rooms and church basements. What you displayed Friday night can't be taught. It's something you either have or you don't. And you definitely have it." Emily felt tears as she processed his words. This was the validation she'd dreamed of, recognition from someone whose opinion mattered. The scared 17-year-old who'd received rejection letters felt vindicated. Dreams deferred weren't dreams denied. Sometimes they waited for the right moment. "Thursday evening at 7, Roberto continued. "My studio is above Ramirez Music Shop on East Bay Street. We'll work on an original composition, an opportunity for each musician to contribute their unique voice." After hanging up, Emily stood feeling the ground had shifted. The familiar restaurant seemed charged with new possibility. She thought about Miguel's pride and her mother's belief that Isabella's gift lived in her granddaughter's hands. Sophia appeared, concerned by Emily's stunned expression. "That was Roberto Sandoval," Emily said wonderingly. "He wants me to record with him." Sophia's shriek of excitement startled the afternoon patrons, but Emily didn't care. For the first time in years, she had news worth sharing. The rest of her shift passed in excitement and nervous energy. Every task felt different. Clearing tables seemed like activities from a previous life. She hummed complex melodies, fingers unconsciously practicing scales. The evening air felt more vivid as she walked to her car, colors more saturated, possibilities endless. Driving through Charleston's historic district, Emily no longer felt excluded from the beauty around her. She belonged to the city's cultural tapestry, no longer just serving those who created art, but about to become one of them. That night, she called Miguel, listening to his excitement echo her own. When he said Isabella would be proud, Emily felt completeness she hadn't experienced in years. The door opening wasn't just leading to opportunities, it was leading her back to herself. Thursday evening arrived with Charleston's golden light, filtering through ancient live oaks. Emily stood outside Ramirez Music Shop, clutching a worn portfolio of sheet music she'd collected since high school. Performance anxiety mixed with anticipation. Not fear of failure, but nervous energy of standing on transformation's threshold. The narrow stairs creaked as she climbed toward Roberto's studio, walls lined with photographs of legendary musicians, welcoming her into a lineage she'd never imagined joining. The scent of old wood and rosin created an atmosphere both sacred and familiar. Roberto greeted her warmly, smaller than imagined, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes holding decades of musical stories. The intimate studio had exposed brick, walls and acoustic panels, professional yet welcoming. 3 other musicians waited. Carmen, a violinist and middle school teacher. Diego, a bassist from touring acts. And Anna, a vocalist from church choirs and jazz clubs. Roberto explained the evening's project. Bridges, a collaborative piece allowing each musician their unique voice while creating something cohesive. Emily relaxed into familiar musical collaboration language. These weren't intimidating professionals, but fellow artists understanding the same calling. When they began playing, magic happened immediately. Emily's piano provided harmonic foundation, while weaving in melodic elements speaking to her journey, longing of deferred dreams, strength and persistence, joy of being heard. Carmen's violin danced like hope taking flight. Diego's bass provided steady heartbeat. Anna's wordless vocals told stories everyone understood emotionally. The session stretched into evening, time seeming irrelevant as musicians explored different arrangements. Emily suggested harmonic variations with increasing confidence, her instincts awakening after years of dormancy. Roberto treated her ideas with equal respect. During break, Carmen approached curiously about Emily's background. Learning about her hiatus, Carmen responded, "Sometimes the most powerful art comes from people who've lived real life between training and expression. You bring wisdom, experience, survival, something no conservatory teaches." As Bridges faded into the studio's warm atmosphere, Emily felt profound shift in understanding herself. This wasn't just about music. It was reclaiming identity as someone whose voice mattered, whose dreams deserved serious pursuit. Roberto handed her a business card and USB drive with the evening's recording. I'm putting together a small ensemble for upcoming performances, intimate venues around the city. We need a pianist who understands music is about telling truth. I think you might be exactly what we're looking for. The drive home felt like floating, mind filled with created sounds and suggested possibilities. The nervous woman who'd entered the studio felt like a stranger, replaced by someone who'd spent an evening doing exactly what she was meant to do. Back in her apartment, Emily sat at her small electric keyboard. As she played the evening's melodies, the instrument's limitations seemed less important. What mattered wasn't piano quality or venue size or critic recognition. It was the music itself, the connection between heart and hands, the bridge between dreams and reality she'd finally learned to cross.